London, 1818. In a world where beauty was currency and marriage the ultimate transaction, I was bankrupt before I ever entered the ballroom. I, Charlotte Pemberton, never imagined that a single whispered sentence would transform me from the court's most pitied wallflower into the object of the season's most scandalous courtship. That the most desired man in all of London would cross a crowded ballroom with his eyes fixed on me. That 3 words would shatter everything I believed about my worth. But what I really didn't know is that true beauty has nothing to do with what the world sees in a mirror. This is the story of a woman who learned that being seen, truly seen, by the right person changes everything. And that love, when it's real, doesn't just accept our flaws, it cherishes them. But before we dive into this story that challenged every expectation of Regency society, tell me, from which corner of the world are you watching? Leave your comment, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell, because this journey promises to be unforgettable. The truth is always more fascinating than fiction. There are certain truths one learns to accept early in life, particularly when one is a woman navigating the treacherous waters of London society. Mine came at the age of 14, standing before my mother's full-length mirror in a gown meant for my first formal dinner party. I was not beautiful. This revelation arrived not with dramatic fanfare, but with the quiet certainty of mathematics. My reflection showed a girl with features that stubbornly refused to arrange themselves into anything approaching conventional attractiveness. My hair, an indeterminate shade that couldn't commit to being either properly brown or respectably auburn, possessed a willful texture that rejected pins and ribbons with equal enthusiasm. My face was too long, my nose too prominent, my frame too angular where other young ladies curved gracefully. My mother, bless her optimistic heart, attempted reassurance with words about inner beauty and intelligence being far more valuable than mere physical appearance. But we both knew the currency of our world, and I was poor indeed. 9 years later, at 23, I had become something of a fixture at social events, not for my charm, mind you, but for my reliable presence in corners and behind potted plants. I had developed quite an expertise in blending with decorative foliage. The evening of the Ashford ball began like countless others. My maid, Margaret, performed her usual miracles with my impossible hair, managing to coax it into something that might charitably be called a coiffure. The gown my mother had commissioned was lovely, a soft green silk that she insisted brought out flecks of colour in my eyes. I suspected she was being generous, but I appreciated the effort nonetheless. The Ashford residence blazed with candlelight as our carriage approached, and I felt the familiar tightening in my chest that preceded these events. My mother squeezed my hand with understanding that required no words. She knew what these evenings cost me, yet society demanded our presence, and so we attended, performing our roles with practiced precision. Inside, the ballroom swirled with colour and movement. Young ladies in pastel confections danced with gentlemen in elegant evening wear, while matrons observed from gilt chairs, their sharp eyes cataloguing every interaction for later dissection. I made my way to my customary position near a substantial palm, nodding to other wallflowers who had claimed their own territories. I was contemplating whether the refreshment table might offer some diversion when the room's atmosphere shifted with palpable suddenness. Lord Alexander Blackwood had arrived. I had seen him before, naturally. One could hardly move through London society without encountering its most celebrated bachelor. But seeing Alexander Blackwood and truly observing him were entirely different experiences. Tonight, he wore deep navy that made his dark hair seem even more dramatic against skin that suggested he spent time outdoors, rather than languishing in drawing rooms. His height allowed him to survey the room with an ease that spoke of absolute confidence in his place within it. Every unmarried woman in the vicinity, oriented toward him like flowers seeking sun, and I watched this familiar phenomenon with detached amusement. Lady Beatrice Worthington, widely acknowledged as the season's incomparable beauty, positioned herself strategically in his likely path, her golden curls catching the candlelight in a way that seemed almost calculated. I returned my attention to the safer contemplation of my surroundings, content to observe rather than participate in the evening's romantic theatre, which is precisely why I nearly dropped my fan when I realised Lord Blackwood was looking directly at me. Surely I had misinterpreted. I glanced subtly behind me. Perhaps there was someone more worthy of his attention standing in my shadow. But no, there was only wall and palm frond, and when I looked back, those extraordinary grey eyes remained fixed on mine with an intensity that made my breath catch in a most inconvenient manner. Then he began walking toward me. My mind raced through possible explanations. Perhaps he confused me with someone else. Perhaps this was some elaborate jest I didn't yet understand. Perhaps I had something absurd on my face, and he approached out of charitable concern. But he didn't stop. He crossed that ballroom floor with purposeful strides, his gaze never wavering, until he stood before me close enough that I caught the scent of sandalwood and something else, something expensive and masculine that made me acutely aware of my own rapid heartbeat. The conversations around us had quieted, and I felt the weight of dozens of eyes marking this inexplicable moment. When Lord Blackwood finally spoke, his voice was low, meant only for my ears, yet it carried an intensity that seemed to reverberate through my entire being. His words were simple, direct, and utterly incomprehensible given our circumstances. He told me he wanted me, not in the polite, socially acceptable way of requesting a dance or inquiring about my health. The words carried weight and intention that bypassed all conventional pretense. I stood there, acutely conscious of my inadequacies, of the beautiful women surrounding us who would have been far more logical recipients of such attention, of the absolute impossibility of what had just occurred. And yet, as Lord Alexander Blackwood waited for my response, with an expression that suggested he had just declared something perfectly reasonable, I realised that my carefully constructed understanding of my place in this world had just been thoroughly, irrevocably disrupted. The morning after the Ashford ball, I convinced myself the entire encounter had been a fever dream, brought on by an overactive imagination, and perhaps that second glass of champagne I should have declined. But then, Lord Alexander Blackwood appeared at our doorstep. My mother nearly fainted when our butler announced him, and I felt a peculiar sensation in my stomach that might have been panic or excitement or some alarming combination of both. I watched from the drawing-room window as he dismounted from a magnificent black horse, with the kind of athletic grace that made me acutely aware of my own tendency to trip over perfectly flat surfaces. He had come to request permission to take me driving in Hyde Park. My mother's expressions cycled through shock, suspicion, and ultimately a cautious hope that made my chest ache. She agreed with the appropriate maternal concern about propriety and chaperonage, though I noticed her hands trembled slightly as she rang for tea. I descended the stairs, with all the enthusiasm of Marie Antoinette approaching the guillotine, certain that this was some elaborate prelude to public humiliation. Perhaps Lord Blackwood collected awkward encounters with unsuitable women the way other gentlemen collected snuff-boxes. But when I entered the drawing-room and saw his face brighten with what appeared to be genuine pleasure at my arrival, my cynical theories wavered dangerously. Our conversation during tea was surprisingly effortless. He inquired about my interests with what seemed like authentic curiosity, rather than polite obligation. When I mentioned my fondness for scientific journals, an admission that usually caused gentlemen's eyes to glaze over, he engaged me in a spirited discussion about recent advances in astronomy that left my mother looking vaguely concerned about the propriety of discussing celestial bodies in mixed company. The drive through Hyde Park that afternoon became the first of many. London society watched our courtship unfold with the fascinated horror usually reserved for carriage accidents. I could see the questions in their eyes, hear the whispers that followed us like an unpleasant perfume. What could he possibly see in her? Surely this was temporary madness that would pass once he came to his senses. Lady Beatrice Worthington's reactions were particularly instructive. At the Pemberton soirée, she positioned herself in Alexander's path with the determination of a military strategist, only to watch him offer her a polite nod before making his way directly to where I stood, attempting to disappear into the wallpaper. He asked me to dance, not just once, but 3 times throughout the evening, which by social convention was practically a declaration of serious intent. I had never been a graceful dancer. My limbs seemed to forget their proper coordination the moment music began, and I had resigned myself years ago to sitting out most sets. But Alexander guided me through the waltz with a patience that somehow made my missteps seem less catastrophic. When I accidentally stepped on his foot for the second time, he actually laughed, and assured me that his boots were quite sturdy and could withstand far worse. The real revelation came during our 3rd week of acquaintance, when he invited me to ride with him early one morning in the less crowded hours of the park. I had confessed during one of our conversations that I loved riding but rarely indulged, because my rather spirited mare intimidated most stable grooms. Alexander arrived with a horse for me that was clearly chosen for more than just aesthetic appeal. She was responsive and intelligent, and I felt the familiar joy of a good gallop that I had denied myself for far too long. We rode in companionable silence for a time, before he began speaking about his own life with a candour that surprised me. He described the suffocating expectations that came with being heir to a dukedom, the constant awareness that people wanted access to his title and fortune, rather than genuine connection with him as a person. There was a loneliness in his words that resonated with my own experiences, though from an entirely different direction. I found myself sharing things I had never voiced to anyone, my love of late-night reading when the house was quiet, my secret attempts at writing poetry that would make serious poets weep with despair, my frustration with a society that valued ornamental qualities over substantive ones. He listened in a way that felt rare and precious, as though my words mattered beyond mere politeness. But even as our connection deepened, the whispers grew louder. At Lady Hertford's garden party, I overheard a conversation between 2 matrons who apparently believed the hedge I stood behind rendered me invisible. They dissected my inadequacies with surgical precision, my lack of beauty, my unsuitable intellect, my complete inappropriateness for a man of Lord Blackwood's stature. They predicted, with absolute certainty, that his interest would wane once the novelty wore off. Their words found the vulnerable places in my armour and burrowed deep. That evening, when Alexander came to call, I found myself more guarded, searching his expressions for signs of wavering commitment or growing regret. If he noticed my withdrawal, he gave no indication, instead regaling me with an amusing account of his attempts to convince his estate manager that modern agricultural techniques wouldn't bring about the apocalypse. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door and turned back to me with an expression of such open warmth that it made my breath catch. He told me that my company had become the part of his day he most anticipated, that conversations with me challenged and delighted him in equal measure. I wanted desperately to believe him, but the voices of doubt, now amplified by Lady Beatrice's increasingly pointed comments and society's collective disapproval, whispered that this was too good to be true, that eventually he would see me as everyone else did, as the unsuitable, unattractive woman who had somehow tricked him into temporary infatuation. Still, When he asked permission to call again the following day, I said yes, because despite my fears and insecurities, I was already falling in love with Alexander Blackwood, and I couldn't seem to stop myself even if I wanted to. By the 6th week of Alexander's courtship, I had developed the uncomfortable realization that hope was far more dangerous than resignation had ever been. When one expects nothing, disappointment holds no power. But when one begins to imagine a future filled with morning rides and stimulating conversations and the warmth of being truly seen by another person, well, that was when vulnerability became a liability. Our pattern had become established with the reliability of clockwork. Alexander called most afternoons, and we would walk through the gardens or sit in my family's drawing room discussing everything from political philosophy to the ridiculous trends in ladies' fashion that seemed designed purely to inconvenience the wearer. My mother had stopped hovering quite so obviously, though I occasionally caught her watching us with an expression that mingled maternal concern with cautious optimism. It was during one of our walks through Kensington Gardens that I experienced both the highest peak and lowest valley of our evolving relationship. The afternoon was unseasonably warm for late spring, and Alexander had suggested we seek shade near the Italian gardens. We found a relatively secluded bench beneath an ancient oak, far enough from the main paths that the usual parade of society matrons and their charges seemed blessedly distant. Alexander had been quieter than usual, and I found myself filling the silence with nervous observations about the gardens and the weather and other thoroughly uninteresting topics. Finally, he placed his hand gently over mine, where it rested on the bench between us, stopping my verbal cascade. The touch sent an unexpected jolt through me, not unpleasant, but startling in its intensity. He asked me with a directness that I had come to recognize as characteristic, why I seemed to doubt his sincerity. What had he done, he wanted to know, to make me question his intentions toward me? The question caught me completely unprepared. I had worked so hard to hide my insecurities behind practiced composure, yet somehow he had seen through my performance. The defenses I had carefully constructed began to crumble, and before I could stop myself, the truth came spilling out. I told him about the whispers and the speculation, about Lady Beatrice's increasingly bold suggestions that he was merely amusing himself before moving on to a more suitable match, about my own confusion regarding what a man like him could possibly want with a woman like me, a woman whose mirror confirmed daily that she possessed none of the qualities society valued. The words emerged with more raw honesty than I had intended, and I felt exposed in a way that made me want to flee back to the safety of my carefully maintained emotional distance. Alexander listened without interruption, his grey eyes never leaving my face. When I finally fell silent, embarrassed by my outburst, he remained quiet for a long moment, as though carefully considering his response. What he said next altered something fundamental in how I understood our connection. He spoke about intelligence, not as an abstract quality, but as something vibrant and attractive that made every conversation with me an adventure in discovering new perspectives. He described how my refusal to perform false modesty or feigned ignorance refreshed him after years of interactions with women who had been taught that appearing less intelligent made them more desirable. He mentioned strength, and I nearly laughed at the absurdity until I heard the conviction in his voice. The strength, he explained, of remaining authentically myself in a society that would have preferred I diminish and apologize for my existence. The courage it took to be honest in a world that rewarded pretty lies. Then he said something that lodged itself directly in my heart and refused to dislodge. He told me he saw grace in movements I considered awkward, beauty in features I had spent years wishing I could change, and a spirit that captivated him more thoroughly than any conventional prettiness ever could. But more than that, and his voice dropped to something almost vulnerable when he said this, He had spent his entire life being wanted for his appearance, his title, his wealth. People saw a duke's heir, not a person. They wanted what he represented, not who he was. With me, he felt seen for perhaps the first time in his adult life. I struggled to find words adequate to respond, my throat tight with emotions I couldn't quite name. Before I could formulate something coherent, a voice interrupted our moment with the precision of a blade finding its target. Lady Beatrice had materialized on the path before us with two other young ladies in tow, all carrying the satisfied expressions of cats who had cornered particularly interesting prey. She expressed surprise at finding us in such a secluded location, her tone dripping with implications about propriety that made my face burn with embarrassment. Alexander stood with the kind of cold courtesy that could have frozen the Thames, offering minimal pleasantries before making it abundantly clear that our conversation was concluded and her presence was neither required nor desired. But the damage had been done. The intimate bubble we had created had been thoroughly burst, and the walk back to my home was coloured by my acute awareness that Lady Beatrice would waste no time spreading whatever interpretation of our garden encounter best served her purposes. That evening, my mother received 3 separate visits from concerned acquaintances, all expressing worry about my reputation, given how much time I spent alone with Lord Blackwood. The implication was clear. He was playing with my affections, and I would be the one left ruined when he inevitably moved on. I lay awake that night, replaying Alexander's words in my mind, wanting desperately to believe them, while fighting against years of conditioning that insisted I was fundamentally unworthy of such regard. The truth was, I had begun to love him with a totality that terrified me, and that love made me vulnerable in ways I had never experienced during my years of protective isolation. When sleep finally came, my dreams were confused tangles of ballrooms and gardens, of grey eyes that saw too much, and of whispered warnings from voices I couldn't quite identify, but whose words echoed the fears I carried in my own heart. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered with our usual post, as though it were nothing more consequential than an invitation to tea. I recognized immediately that something was wrong. The paper was expensive but unmarked, the handwriting unfamiliar, and there was no return address, all signs that this correspondence preferred anonymity to accountability. My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal, and what I read in those carefully penned lines detonated my world with surgical precision. The letter detailed a wager supposedly made between Alexander and several of his gentleman friends at their club. The terms were explicit and cruel. He was to make the ugliest woman of the season fall completely in love with him before summer's end. The reward was substantial, £500, and the eternal admiration of his peers for accomplishing what they deemed impossible. According to the anonymous author, I had been selected as the perfect target for this entertainment. My lack of beauty made me appropriately challenging, while my obvious inexperience with male attention ensured I would be pathetically easy to deceive. The letter included details that seemed far too specific to be fabricated, dates of our encounters, snippets of conversations, observations about Alexander's behaviour that matched my own memories with sickening accuracy. The writer claimed to be motivated by conscience, unable to watch an innocent woman be so thoroughly humiliated for the amusement of bored aristocrats. They suggested I end the association immediately to preserve what remained of my dignity. I read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of horror in its implications. Everything suddenly made terrible sense. Alexander's inexplicable interest, his persistence despite society's disapproval, his seemingly genuine affection. Of course, a man like him wouldn't actually want a woman like me. How could I have been so foolish as to believe otherwise? The voice in My head that had always whispered my inadequacies now shouted with vindicated fury. I had allowed myself to hope, to imagine a future, to fall in love, and this was the inevitable result of such presumption. I should have known better. My mother found me still sitting with the letter in my lap an hour later, my tea gone cold, and my face undoubtedly revealing the devastation I felt. She read the letter with growing alarm, then immediately declared it obvious slander that I should dismiss entirely. But I couldn't. Because as much as I wanted to believe in Alexander's sincerity, the letter's version of events aligned perfectly with my deepest fears about my own unworthiness. When Alexander arrived that afternoon for our planned outing, I met him in the drawing room with the letter clutched in my hand, and my heart armoured against further injury. His expression shifted from pleasure at seeing me to concern as he registered my demeanour. He asked what was wrong with such apparent genuine worry that I almost wavered in my resolve. Instead, I handed him the letter without preamble. I watched his face as he read, saw confusion give way to shock and then to something that looked remarkably like anguish. When he finished, he looked up at me with those grey eyes that had haunted my dreams, and I saw in them something I couldn't quite interpret. Hurt, perhaps, or disbelief? He denied everything with vehement conviction, told me the letter was absolute fabrication, that no such wager existed, that whoever had written this malicious document was intent on destroying what we had built together. His voice carried such intensity that I wanted desperately to believe him. But how could I? The words poured out of me then. All my accumulated doubts and insecurities, every whispered comment I had overheard, every moment I had questioned what someone like him saw in someone like me. I told him I had been a fool to believe this courtship was genuine, that I should have known from the beginning that his interest was some form of cruel entertainment. Alexander's expression transformed as I spoke, hurt giving way to something harder, frustration perhaps, or anger at being doubted. He insisted again on his innocence, demanded to know who had sent the letter so he could confront them directly. But I was beyond reason, drowning in the certainty that I had been played for a fool in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. I told him I never wanted to see him again. The words came out more forcefully than I intended, propelled by the desperate need to end this before he could reject me first, before the wager could be concluded with my complete and utter humiliation. Alexander stood frozen for a long moment, the letter still in his hand, looking at me as though I were a stranger. He opened his mouth several times as if to speak, but no words emerged. Finally, with a stiffness that suggested iron control over strong emotion, he placed the letter on the table, between us. He told me, in a voice carefully devoid of inflection, that if I believed him capable of such cruelty, perhaps I had never known him at all. That he had thought what we shared was built on more than just his declarations, that it included trust and understanding and genuine connection. His words felt like accusations, and perhaps they were. Then he left, and the drawing room seemed vastly emptier than it had any right to be. My mother tried to comfort me, suggesting we investigate the letter's origins, that we give Alexander opportunity to prove his innocence. But I couldn't bear to hope again, couldn't survive another cycle of belief followed by inevitable disappointment. That night, I cried for the first time since I was a child. Not delicate, feminine tears, but great shuddering sobs that came from somewhere deep and raw. I mourned not just the loss of Alexander's company, but the loss of the woman I had briefly been when I was with him, confident, valued, worthy of genuine affection. The following days passed in a grey fog. I declined all social invitations, unwilling to face the speculation and pity that would surely follow news of our rift. My mother watched me with helpless concern, clearly wanting to fix what was broken, but unsure how to proceed. Alexander did not call again. Whatever we had shared, real or fabricated, was thoroughly, irrevocably finished, and I was left alone with the cold certainty that I had been right all along about my place in the world, and wrong to ever imagine I deserved anything more. There is a particular quality to heartbreak that I had never fully appreciated until I experienced it firsthand. A physical heaviness that settles in one's chest and refuses to lift. A persistent ache that colours every waking moment with a dull grey monotony. I discovered I could miss someone with an intensity that felt almost violent in its demands. The days following my confrontation with Alexander blurred together in an unremarkable succession of hours I simply had to endure. I went through the motions of daily life with mechanical precision, dressing, eating, conversing when absolutely necessary, but some essential part of me had retreated to a place where Alexander's betrayal couldn't reach it again, except it did reach, constantly. I would find myself in the middle of reading and realize I had absorbed nothing from the past 3 pages because my mind had wandered to something Alexander had said about the book's author. Or I would be taking tea and remember how he preferred his without sugar, claiming it masked the subtler flavors. Every corner of my life had been infiltrated by memories of him, and now those memories carried the bitter aftertaste of deception. My mother watched me with increasing concern, her usual social butterfly nature subdued by maternal worry. She had stopped suggesting I reconsider my judgment of Alexander's guilt, but I could see the questions in her eyes every time she looked at me. It was my younger brother Timothy who ultimately disrupted my melancholic isolation. He appeared in my sitting room one afternoon in the second week of my self-imposed exile from society, carrying an expression of barely contained excitement mixed with righteous indignation. Timothy, at 19, possessed all the enthusiasm and moral certainty of youth, along with a protective streak regarding his older sister that I found simultaneously touching and exasperating. He announced without preamble that he had discovered something important about the anonymous letter. My first instinct was to dismiss whatever theory he had concocted. I had no desire to revisit that particular source of pain, but Timothy was insistent with the stubborn determination that ran in our family, and eventually I agreed to hear him out, if only to end his pestering. What he revealed made my carefully constructed certainty begin to crumble. Timothy had taken it upon himself to investigate the letter's origins with the thoroughness of someone who had read far too many sensation novels. He had started by examining the paper itself, expensive stock available only from select stationers in London. Then he had compared the handwriting to samples from various sources, a task made easier by his friendship with several young gentlemen who had sisters in society. The conclusion he had reached after 2 weeks of what he described as proper detective work was that the handwriting belonged to Lady Beatrice Worthington. I stared at him, trying to process this information while my mind simultaneously rejected and embraced its implications. Timothy produced his evidence with theatrical flair, samples of Lady Beatrice's handwriting obtained from mutual acquaintances, pointing out distinctive letter formations that matched the anonymous correspondence with damning accuracy. The case he built was compelling, but I found myself resistant to believing it, perhaps because acceptance would mean confronting the enormity of what I had done to Alexander. Timothy, sensing my hesitation, pressed his advantage. He reminded me of Lady Beatrice's obvious displeasure at Alexander's attentions toward me, her increasingly pointed comments at social gatherings, her strategic positioning whenever Alexander entered a room. The forgery, Timothy argued, was perfectly aligned with her interests, removing me as competition, while simultaneously destroying Alexander's regard for me through my own accusations. The logic was sound, horrifyingly so. I felt something, cold and sick, settling in my stomach as I considered the possibility that I had allowed jealousy and manipulation to accomplish exactly what Lady Beatrice intended, that I had taken my deepest insecurities and weaponized them against the one person who had ever made me feel valued for who I actually was. My mother, who had been listening from the doorway, entered the room with an expression of vindication mixed with sympathy. She sat beside me and took my hand, speaking with unusual solemnity about trust and love and the courage required to believe in both when one's self-worth had been systematically undermined by society's casual cruelties. She told me about my father, a revelation that surprised me, given how rarely she spoke of him since his death 5 years prior. My father, she explained, had not been conventionally handsome. He had been a second son with modest prospects, intellectually brilliant but socially awkward, passed over by numerous young ladies before my mother met him at a country assembly. What had made her fall in love with him, she said, was his absolute integrity and the way he saw her, not as a beautiful ornament to display, but as a person with thoughts and dreams that mattered. Their marriage had been extraordinarily happy, precisely because it was built on genuine recognition and respect rather than superficial attraction. The parallel to my situation with Alexander was obvious and painful. She asked me gently but insistently whether I truly believed Alexander capable of the cruelty described in that letter, whether the man who had spent weeks engaging my mind, respecting my opinions, and sharing his own vulnerabilities seemed like someone who would humiliate me for entertainment and profit. When I tried to articulate my certainty of his guilt, I found the arguments dissolving even as I spoke them. What remained was the uncomfortable realization that I had allowed my own lack of self-worth to make me vulnerable to manipulation, had chosen to believe the worst because it aligned with what I already believed about my own inadequacy. I had hurt Alexander terribly with my accusations and my refusal to trust him. The shame of that realization was almost unbearable. I had claimed to care for him while simultaneously demonstrating that I thought him capable of monstrous deception. I had demanded he prove his sincerity while offering none of my own in return. Timothy, practical as ever, suggested I go to Alexander immediately and explain everything: the forgery, my investigation, my regret. My mother agreed, adding that pride was a cold companion compared to love, and that genuine connection required the courage to be vulnerable, even when vulnerability felt terrifying. But as I sat there, contemplating the prospect of facing Alexander after what I had said, after how thoroughly I had rejected both him and what we had shared, I felt paralyzed by a fear more profound than any I had experienced before. What if he wouldn't forgive me? What if my accusations had destroyed something that couldn't be repaired? What if I went to him with my apologies and explanations only to discover that his regard, once withdrawn, could not be restored? The thought of risking further rejection made me want to retreat back into the safe isolation I had inhabited before Alexander disrupted my carefully ordered world. But the alternative, living the rest of my life, knowing I had destroyed the most precious thing I had ever been offered because I was too afraid to trust it, was somehow even more unbearable. Fear, I discovered, could masquerade as prudence with remarkable effectiveness. For 3 days after Timothy's revelation about the forged letter, I constructed elaborate justifications for why I should wait before approaching Alexander. I needed to gather my thoughts, prepare what I would say, ensure I had irrefutable proof of Lady Beatrice's deception. These seemed like reasonable considerations, but in truth, they were merely sophisticated forms of cowardice. My mother, demonstrating a patience that must have cost her considerable effort, allowed me this time without overt pressure. But I caught her watching me with an expression that suggested she understood exactly what I was doing, and found it both frustrating and pitiable in equal measure. It was the fourth morning when she finally intervened directly. She appeared at my bedroom door as Margaret was helping me dress, dismissed the maid with a gentle wave, and sat on the edge of my bed with the air of someone preparing to have a difficult but necessary conversation. What she said next proved to be exactly the catalyst I needed, though not in any way I anticipated. She told me she was dying. The words hit me with such force that for a moment I couldn't process them as anything but some sort of dark jest. But her expression held no humour, only a terrible, calm acceptance that made my blood run cold. She hastened to clarify. She wasn't actively dying in the immediate sense, but a physician she had consulted regarding persistent fatigue had diagnosed a condition of the heart that would, inevitably, shorten her life considerably. She had perhaps a few years, possibly less. She had chosen not to burden the family with this knowledge, but watching me waste precious days in paralysis had convinced her that some truths needed to be shared. I felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath me. My mother continued speaking, her voice steady despite the tears I could feel burning behind my own eyes. She told me that her greatest regret would be leaving this world knowing I had allowed fear to dictate my choices, that I had rejected love because I couldn't believe I deserved it. She spoke about time as the most valuable and finite resource we possess, about how she had wasted too many years of her own youth worrying about what others thought, rather than pursuing what brought her joy. She didn't want that same regret for me. Then she said something that broke through every defense I had constructed. She told me that watching Alexander look at me had reminded her of how my father used to look at her, as though she was the solution to a question he hadn't known he was asking. That kind of recognition, she insisted, was extraordinarily rare, and throwing it away because I was afraid of being hurt was choosing a different kind of death, a slow suffocation of the spirit rather than the body. I broke then, completely and thoroughly, sobbing in her arms like I hadn't done since childhood. The grief was layered for her impending loss, for my own foolishness, for the time I had wasted, for Alexander, and what my accusations must have cost him. When the storm finally passed and I could breathe again, my mother held my face in her hands and asked me a single question. What was I actually afraid of? The answer, when I finally articulated it, was brutally simple. I was afraid that if I went to Alexander and he rejected me, it would confirm what I had always suspected, that I was fundamentally unworthy of love, that the brief period of happiness I had experienced with him was an aberration that couldn't be sustained. My mother's response was characteristically direct. She pointed out that I had already experienced rejection by rejecting Alexander first, that I was already living in the reality I feared. Going to him and offering genuine apology might result in further hurt, yes, but it also offered the possibility of restoration. Staying away guaranteed only continued misery. The logic was irrefutable, and yet still I hesitated. That afternoon, Timothy returned with additional findings from his investigation. He had located the stationer who sold the paper used for the anonymous letter, and, through careful questioning disguised as casual conversation, had confirmed that Lady Beatrice had purchased that specific stock 3 days before the letter arrived at our home. More damningly, he had spoken with Lord Pemberton, a distant cousin who frequented the same gentlemen's club as Alexander. Lord Pemberton had stated categorically that no such wager existed, that he had never heard Alexander speak of me with anything but respect and genuine affection, and that he would be happy to provide sworn testimony to that effect if required. The evidence of my error was now overwhelming. I spent that evening composing and discarding countless versions of what I might say to Alexander. Every attempt seemed inadequate to express the depth of my regret, the magnitude of my mistake. How did one apologize for such fundamental distrust? How did one ask forgiveness for choosing to believe the worst rather than extending the benefit of doubt. Finally, I abandoned the attempt to script my contrition. Whatever I said would have to come from honest acknowledgement of my failures rather than carefully crafted rhetoric. The following morning, I dressed with more care than I had taken in weeks, though not for vanity's sake. I wanted to show Alexander that I respected him enough to present myself properly, that this wasn't a casual social call, but rather something profoundly important. As my carriage rolled toward the Blackwood residence in Mayfair, my heart hammered with such violence that I wondered if I had inherited my mother's heart condition and would expire before I could make my apologies. The irony of that possibility was not lost on me. The butler who answered the door recognized me, his expression carefully neutral in the way of well-trained servants who witnessed their employer's personal dramas. He informed me that Lord Blackwood was in his library and asked if I wished to be announced. I told him no, that I would see myself in, and before he could protest this breach of protocol, I was already moving down the hallway toward the library with determined steps that I hoped masked the terror churning in my stomach. I paused outside the library door, my hand raised to knock, and allowed myself one moment of complete honesty about what I was risking. Then, before courage could desert me entirely, I opened the door. Alexander sat at his desk, surrounded by books and papers, looking as though he hadn't slept properly in days. When he looked up and saw me standing in his doorway, the expression that crossed his face was so complex, hope and hurt and wariness all tangled together, that I felt my carefully planned composure begin to fracture before I had spoken a single word. The silence that stretched between us in that library felt like a living thing, weighted with everything unsaid during our weeks apart. Alexander stood slowly, his movements careful, controlled, as though I were some startled creature that might bolt at sudden motion. His eyes never left my face, and I saw in them a guardedness that hadn't existed before, a wariness I had put there with my accusations and my refusal to trust. I had rehearsed no speech, prepared no elegant phrases. What emerged instead was raw, unpolished truth. I told him I had been wrong. The words came out hoarse, barely above a whisper, but they carried the weight of weeks of misery and self-recrimination. I explained about Timothy's investigation, about the evidence pointing to Lady Beatrice's forgery, about the confirmation that no wager had ever existed. But more importantly, I told him about my own culpability in choosing to believe the worst. I admitted that the letter had been so effective not because of its convincing details, but because it aligned perfectly with what I already believed about myself. That I had spent so many years accepting society's judgment of my worthlessness, that when presented with evidence of his supposed deception, I had embraced it with almost grateful certainty. My voice broke as I told him that my inability to trust his sincerity hadn't been a reflection of his character, but rather a manifestation of my own profound lack of self-worth. That I had been so convinced of my own inadequacy that I couldn't believe someone like him might genuinely value someone like me. Alexander remained silent throughout my confession, his expression unreadable, and with each passing moment of his silence, my certainty that I had destroyed something irreparable grew stronger. I apologized for the hurt my accusations must have caused, for the insult of suggesting he was capable of such cruelty, for allowing my fears to blind me to what we had built together. I told him I understood, if he couldn't forgive me, that I had no right to expect his regard after demonstrating such spectacular lack of faith. When I finally fell silent, emotionally exhausted and trembling with the vulnerability of complete honesty, Alexander moved from behind his desk with slow deliberation. He stopped a few feet away from me, close enough that I could see the fine lines of fatigue around his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the evidence of his own suffering during our separation. When he finally spoke, His voice carried a roughness that suggested strong emotion barely held in check. He told me my distrust had indeed hurt him, deeply and profoundly, because he had thought what we shared included mutual faith in each other's integrity. That my immediate acceptance of the letter's accusations had felt like a betrayal of everything we had built together. But then his tone shifted, softened, as he acknowledged something I hadn't expected. He admitted that he had spent the weeks since our confrontation examining his own role in the disaster. That perhaps he had failed to adequately demonstrate the depth and sincerity of his feelings, had assumed his actions spoke clearly when I needed more explicit reassurance. That he hadn't fully understood how thoroughly society's cruelty had undermined my ability to trust in my own worthiness of affection. He spoke about his own loneliness, the isolation of being valued only for superficial attributes, and how finding someone who engaged his mind and heart, rather than his title and fortune, had felt like discovering something precious he hadn't known he was seeking. But he had been so focused on his own experience of that discovery that he hadn't adequately considered how bewildering and frightening it must have been for me to receive such attention without understanding its genuine foundation. What happened next dissolved the last remnants of my composure. Alexander crossed the remaining distance between us and took my hands in his, the first physical contact we had shared since that afternoon in Kensington Gardens. His touch sent warmth flooding through me, thawing parts that had been frozen since our separation. He told me, with a quiet intensity that left no room for doubt, that he loved me, not despite my perceived flaws, but inclusive of every aspect of who I was. My sharp intellect, my awkward grace, my honest observations, my resistance to social performance, even my capacity for self-doubt, because it made my trust, when given, all the more precious. He acknowledged that my distrust had wounded him, but that he understood its origins, and that understanding created space for forgiveness. That love, if it was worth anything at all, had to include the capacity to weather mistakes and misunderstandings, to rebuild trust after it had been damaged. Then, with a vulnerability that matched my own, he asked if I thought we might try again. This time with more explicit honesty about our fears and insecurities, with clearer communication about our feelings, with deliberate effort to build the kind of trust that could withstand external manipulation. My answer came through tears that were no longer rooted in grief, but in overwhelming relief and gratitude. I told him yes, that I loved him with a totality that had terrified me precisely because it mattered so profoundly, that I wanted nothing more than the opportunity to prove I could be worthy of the faith he placed in me. Alexander's expression transformed then, the guardedness melting into something open and warm and filled with such clear affection that I wondered how I had ever doubted it. He drew me closer, and I allowed myself to lean into his strength, feeling for the first time in weeks the possibility of genuine peace. We stood there in his library for a long while, not speaking, simply existing in the shared relief of restoration. Eventually, Alexander guided me to the sofa where we sat together, and he began describing his plans for our future with an earnestness that made my heart ache in the best possible way. He asked formally for my hand in marriage, presenting a ring that he admitted he had purchased weeks earlier, before the forged letter had destroyed our fledgling understanding. The emerald at its centre caught the afternoon light streaming through the library windows, and when he slipped it onto my finger, I felt as though something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of my own story. I was no longer the ugly woman society pitied. I was Charlotte Pemberton, soon to be Charlotte Blackwood, loved thoroughly and genuinely by a man who saw beauty where others saw only inadequacy. The wedding, when it occurred 3 months later, scandalized and delighted society in equal measure. Lady Beatrice, whose role in the forgery had become public knowledge through channels I suspected involved Timothy's enthusiastic sharing of his detective work, had retreated to her family's estate in disgrace. Her attempts to destroy our relationship had instead solidified it, forcing us to confront and overcome obstacles that ultimately strengthened our foundation. As I stood beside Alexander in the church, exchanging vows that felt both solemn and joyous, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. I had learned that love required not just finding someone who valued you, but developing the courage to believe you were worthy of being valued. That trust was a choice renewed daily, not a permanent state achieved once and maintained effortlessly. And perhaps most importantly, I had discovered that true beauty had nothing to do with mirrors, and everything to do with being genuinely seen, flaws, fears, and all, by someone who chose to love you anyway. The years that followed brought their own challenges and joys. My mother lived long enough to meet her first grandchild, a daughter with Alexander's dark hair, and what my mother insisted was my intellectual curiosity. She passed peacefully in her sleep, content in the knowledge that I had found happiness beyond what society's narrow definitions allowed. Alexander and I built a life that defied conventional expectations, a partnership of genuine equals who challenged and supported each other through the complexities of navigating both personal ambitions and social responsibilities. We were not always perfect in our communication or unwavering in our faith, but we had learned to weather difficulties together rather than allowing them to drive us apart. Sometimes, when I caught my reflection in a mirror, I still saw the features that society had deemed inadequate: the too prominent nose, the angular frame, the uncooperative hair. But increasingly, I also saw what Alexander had always claimed to see: intelligence in my eyes, determination in my jaw, grace in movements I had once considered clumsy. More importantly, I had learned to value myself not for how I appeared in glass, but for who I had become through the courage required to believe in love, even when it seemed impossible. And that, I discovered, was the truest beauty of all, the kind that deepened with time rather than fading with age, that existed independent of society's fickle judgments, that transformed not just how others saw you, but how you saw yourself. I had been the ugliest woman at court until the most desired man whispered he wanted me. But what truly changed everything wasn't his declaration. It was my eventual decision to believe him, to trust that I deserved the love he offered, and to have the courage to build a life on that foundation. The rest, as they say, was simply the beautiful unfolding of that initial leap of faith